The Second World War introduced the idea of total war. Civilians were as much in the firing line in the home, school and factory as soldiers were at the front. Aerial bombing had reached the point where all sides could send waves of aircraft over the cities of their enemy to try and bomb the other side into submission. From the first air raids onwards, the numbers of casualties were shocking. In this programme in Film Century, we'll show some of the arguments that were made to justify the bombing and killing of civilians at the time. We'll use film from both British and German sources. This newsreel shows Stuka planes carrying out precision daylight bombing raids. The music is a popular Nazi song of the time. Limited in range, the Stuka was used to hit specific military targets. It usually carried a single bomb. When the target required a wider coverage, large, heavy bombers were used. This German newsreel reports on one of the most terrifying bombing raids on Britain, the raid on Coventry on the 14th of November 1940. The commentator makes a point of saying that the raid is taking place because the British have bombed non-military targets in Munich.
Über Coventry. Der Bombenschütze löst die ersten Bomben. Unten ist bereits die erste Wirkung zu erkennen. Die Brände werden immer zahlreicher und das ist erst der Anfang. Immer neue Einschläge blitzen auf. Über 500.000 Kilogramm Bomben wurden in einer einzigen Nacht über Coventry abgeworfen.
When bombing raids were reported in British newsreels, the accounts were presented with cheery commentary and lots of pace and style.
The food flying squad is on the road to Coventry after the recent heavy raids on that gallant city. The mobile canteens presented by Her Majesty the Queen and by friends in America raced to the scene of devastation to relieve the distress of those who have lost their homes. This is total war. The fair land of Britain, her gracious cities and her green countryside are now a battleground. We have lately suffered some reverses, but look at these pictures of the people who have just come through the terrible ordeal of fierce bombardment. They show that the spirit that sustained these islands under the autumn blitz is still imperishable.
What do you got, lady? Soup, tea, sandwiches, buns. I bet you ain't got no onions, have you?
Yes, while we can still joke about our troubles, we're still on the road to victory.
The United States of America had not officially joined the war on Britain's side by this time, but they were deeply affected by the news they heard of the nightly raids by German bombers on cities in the south of England, which became known as the Blitz. British propaganda films, as well as newsreels, helped to publicise the Blitz. This is Neighbours Under Fire, which uses film shot at the time and story sequences to convey a very British attitude to the suffering. There's a forced air of jolliness and an emphasis on staying calm. The film concentrates on the homeless in the East End of London, where the docks have been the target of nightly German raids.
In this one small area of dockland, 1,200 were made homeless in one night. The small homes went, and with them the rest and feeding centres set aside by the authorities for just such an emergency. Into the breach, blasted by the bombers, stepped volunteers. Everything was in a muddle at first. The voluntary workers had to think and act quickly. The poor, as always, helped the poor. The small shopkeepers cleared their counters to provide food. The hat went round in factory and pub.
Well, what do we have? All right, come on then.
When the United States did join the war, their government made a series of films explaining to US servicemen why they were at war. This extract from the American series uses some captured German footage. It features that same German bombing raid on Coventry when 380 people were killed and nearly 1,000 seriously injured in one night.
Thousandfold revenge was Coventry. On the night of November 14th, £1 million of bombs were dropped on the city. Coventry was smashed as flat as Warsaw and Rotterdam. The people of Coventry dug their loved ones out of the blasted ruin, saw them to their last resting place in a common grave.
Scenes like these of mass funerals and grief were not shown in Britain. They might have seriously undermined civilian morale and turned people against the war.
Hitler could kill them, but damned if he could lick them.
Despite the dreadful loss of life, the bombing of cities seemed in the main to strengthen people's determination to resist the enemy rather than encourage them to surrender. The bombing forced people together. They might be miserable, but they weren't alone. Let's look at some of this in more detail. These scenes of the effect of German bombing raids on Portsmouth show that the railway has been severely damaged. They're typical aftermath pictures, but untypically they record a direct hit on a communications link, something that rarely happened during bombing raids. Only around 10% of all bombs dropped fell anywhere near their target. We know from the written evidence about these pictures that they were not included in a cinema newsreel. They could have given the enemy important information about the railway line's location. Look at this bombed-out cinema. It was not a military target, but just like the railway scenes from the same newsreel rushes, the pictures were not passed for screening. Perhaps it would be too upsetting to watch a bombed-out cinema while sitting in one. Cathay Gazette began to record interviews with ordinary people who'd been through an air raid. After they've been rehearsed, we can hear what they thought about the subject of bombing cities.
Well, Mr. McGee, after all this, what do you think about us going over to Berlin and doing the same to them?
I should think so, too. A bit worse than this, I hope, with a wicked bugger like he is.
And now, sir, do you think we ought to bomb Berlin the same as they're doing to us in London?
Oh, I definitely do, sir. Bomb them tenfold. I'm sorry for the women and children of Berlin, but what about the women and children of this country?
And what do you think about this question of reprisals?
Well, if I was a man, I'd go over there and I'd give them the same as what they've gave us here.
What no one would do in either German or British newsreels is show close-up pictures of suffering or grief. If the pictures could disguise suffering while hinting at bravery, then that would probably earn them a place in a newsreel story. This German newsreel says that the people of Mannheim are determined to win the war despite the bombing raids which have destroyed so much of the city. They carry banners which say they will not be defeated. Victory will still be theirs.
Organisationsleiter Dr. Ley spricht vor dem zerstörten Mannheimer Schloss. Er erinnert an das Wort des Führers. Die Ausgebombten sind die Avantgarde der Rache.
These German newsreel pictures show Berliners making do after a heavy night's air raid by the RAF.
Dr. Goebbels überzeugt sich selbst von der planmäßigen Durchführung der angeordneten Maßnahmen. Die NSV schafft Lebensmittel heran. In der 4-Millionen-Stadt braucht trotz der Schäden niemand zu hungern. Die Frauenschaft verteilt Butterbrote für die Bombengeschädigten. Eier, Zigaretten, Obst, an alles ist gedacht. Die Hilfsorganisationen leisten mustergültige Arbeit. Verbände der Wehrmacht werden zu Aufräumungsarbeiten eingesetzt. Die Straße wird so schnell wie nur möglich für den Verkehr wieder freigemacht. Leichte Schäden sind in kürzester Zeit behoben. Zerstörte Eisenbahnanlagen und Brücken werden ebenfalls rasch wiederhergestellt. Arbeitsanfang 8 Uhr. Trotz zahlreicher Behinderungen im Verkehr versucht jeder Berliner pünktlich an seinen Arbeitsplatz zu gelangen. Kraftfahrer nehmen bereitwillig Passanten mit. Ganz Berlin bildet in diesen Tagen eine einzige verschworene Kampfgemeinschaft. Wir lassen uns nicht unterkriegen. Der Stadtkommandant. In den Zeitungen werden laufend Verordnungen über Sonderzuteilungen bekannt gegeben. Die Lebensmittelzufuhr nach Berlin erleidet keine Stockung. Wo die Läden zerstört sind, haben die Händler Notverkaufsstände eingerichtet.
As the tide of war turned in favour of Britain and her allies, the numbers and strength of the air raids on Germany increased enormously. Raids by 1,000 bombers at one time were not unusual. In a round-the-clock offensive, the Americans bombed by day and the RAF by night, inflicting massive damage on German cities. The most notorious and controversial of all the air raids on Germany came in February 1945, when the city of Dresden was virtually destroyed by the Allies. This newsreel still managed to justify the raid.
RAF heavy bombers assist Marshal Connieff's drive into the Reich. The target is Dresden. It was being used to pump German troops into counterattacks against the Russian army not many miles to the east. This strike put a stop to that. The night sky is pitted with aircraft, vari-colored target markers, and the newest German attack device, a scarecrow designed to burst and look like a plane exploding after a direct hit. Static electrical discharge caused by intense cold mars these magnificent bombing shots. The day after the RAF strike at Dresden, B-17 bombers of the 8th United States Air Force gave the city a repeat performance. After these attacks, the German overseas news agency said, "This city, hitherto almost untouched, has been carpeted by heavy and super heavy high explosives and incendiaries. Dresden is a heap of ruins. It has been smashed to atoms."
Estimates suggest that at least 70,000 men, women and children were killed in this single bombing raid. In the summer of 1945, Allied scientists produced a devastating new weapon, the atom bomb. The war in Europe was over, but the war with Japan was still raging, and the Americans felt that only the use of this new atom bomb would force the Japanese to surrender. So on the 6th of August 1945, a single US bomber set off for the city of Hiroshima. This newsreel contains footage shot by the Americans from the air and by the Japanese on the ground. It was released soon after the Japanese surrender.
When it was all over, 4.5 square miles of Hiroshima was burned and blasted to extinction. The all-shattering devastation in which was born the atomic age. In its birth pangs, 75,000 people were killed, 70,000 injured. The city's 3 surviving hospitals were swamped by the myriad sufferers. Their plight glimpsed in these official Japanese pictures, now shown for the first time. Radiation effects were fantastically imprinted on walls and furniture like frozen shadows, a ladder outlined on a building. The design of her dress left on the body of a woman who would die in a few days anyhow, not from her burns or visible wounds, but from radioactivity, the killer that invisibly turns the blood into lifeless water. In atom war, the sins of the fathers are visited on the children.
Those are some of the worst pictures of civilian suffering that came out of the Second World War. They caused worldwide revulsion, even though many thought the action was justified. By the end of the war, the world had entered the nuclear age, in which one single bomb could destroy a complete city.